Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support the podcast. Best way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. We do private weekly chats with members only every week or two. I also do a weekly roundup of the news and my own commentary. And sometimes we bring back past podcast guests to do a live Q&A with paid subscribers only. So do check that out over at the Substack. You can also donate through Buy Me a Coffee Wise donor box, as well as Bitcoin. Now is a great time to send me some Bitcoin. You can also purchase a consult if you want to chat with me about expatriating, geopolitics, or the meaning of life. And do check out all of my affiliates: EasyDNS, Legal Shield, Escape the Technocracy, Wise Wolf Gold, Above Phone. And I do have a new one over at the website. It's fellow Croat. He's got a couple of apps that he's put out called Citizen HR, Citizen Italy, and Citizen Poland. So if you have heritage, it's Croatian or Polish or Italian, you can use the app to help speed up the naturalization process. So do check that out. Leave a podcast review as well. And joining us on this edition is our Mathew Crawford of roundingtheearth.substack.com and Gabe, a Canadian who's passionate about the free and open web. His website is Libre Solutions.network. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, amigos.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Gabe, Mathew, this is, I don't know, your second or third time on Geopolitics and Empire. And Gabe, it's your first on Geopolitics and Empire, but we spoke many times on TNT Radio. So it's good to have you here. And the timing on this, I don't know if Mathew knew, if he could predict the future, but we'll be talking Bitcoin, crypto, and whatnot. I think this morning I was checking the price. So we did go beyond 89,000 a Bitcoin. So what's going on here, guys?
Yeah, I think that that everything has been heading to this point in a planned out way. A number of months ago, I thought, no matter what happens, Trump is. I think he was scheduled to win this election. The whole, first we have Kennedy jump on the Bitcoin wagon, and then Trump later on, and it had already felt like there was some sort of like a uniparty, sort of push, right? It felt planned to me. And there's so many Bitcoiners and Bitcoin influence and cryptocurrency influence going on within the pandemic media that it just sort of screamed, there's something going on here to me. So I've somewhat started calling, when I've talked to friends, especially in the cryptocurrency world, I've sometimes thrown in the phrase Bitcoin pandemonium, just to see how they would respond to it, just to see what they would say. And part of the reason that I began thinking along those lines is when I started doing statistics on the pandemic, and my Substack started to become popular because I'd been pointing out for months that showed no effectiveness and were probably some number of people. I got invited to San Juan, and the media group Roundtable Media had been put together by some of the billionaire Bitcoiners. And this includes Brock Pierce, who had run for president in 2020 in the US, but by the way, he does work with the United Nations. And then I met Craig. I'm forgetting his name, but Brock and Craig are two of the co-founders of Tether. And then I guess David Bailey was also one of the funders of this media group that pulled this together. Though I don't think they liked me. I didn't plan to move over to their media group, and they had offered me some stock and other stuff. So anyhow, ever since then, I've just sort of looked around and I've realized, there's so many people in the medical freedom movement related to Bitcoin, and one of those is Steve Kirsch. And in fact, I'm going to bring this up right now. Somebody who used to work for Steve Kirsch on a project called One ID is Adam Back. And Adam Back is on the short list of people that are suspected of being Satoshi Nakamoto. He was one of the cypherpunks, and he knew Hal Finney at the very least. But shortly after the creation of Bitcoin, he moved to Malta. And, the explanation for this was, that it's a tax haven. But I actually, there's part of me that wonders, is the, grand global governance, could we point to the superstructures of the past, like the Knights of Malta, as being part of that military occult banking syndicate, as I sometimes like to call it?
I just on that, I may have mentioned this before, but I've had a fun experience, minor experience with the Knights of Malta. I don't know if I mentioned to this with you before in our previous chat, but when I was a graduate student, we went on a week-long study trip to Rome, and we saw some interesting places, but we were allowed entry into the private, not open to the public headquarters of the Knights of the Order of Malta in Rome, because our professor, this retired Italian international lawyer, her late husband had been a member. And I guess through that connection, I got photos, and they got this church with like skulls and Masonic imagery and snakes going through skulls, all this crazy stuff. And inadvertently later on, I ended up staying in the home, maybe castle in Milan, of the Knight of Milan of the Order of Malta. It was a friend of a friend, and I met the guy. It was the older Italian dude, and we were just there, just friends of friends, and so that was the closest I've ever gotten to that world of the Order of Malta.
Interesting. Well, it's tough to say where all the power lies, right? Because in all these relationships, it's just very difficult to know who's pulling whose strings. One thing that I did notice, I had kind of an interesting past year thinking through Bitcoin, because I became a Bitcoiner and proponent of Bitcoin in 2017, but I had noticed so many odd intersections with Bitcoin and people that I came not to trust, and that included Steve Kirsch. But I noticed that that the U.S. military was publishing papers on Bitcoin and blockchain, as early as 2011, right? And the U.S. military isn't going to take something seriously that's not meant to be taken seriously on that level, right? So, I'm kind of just throwing out a few little facts here to get people to understand why it is that I wanted to take sort of a second look, and why it is that I wanted to reevaluate the entire thesis of Bitcoin. And I'm still not sure what to believe about it, but hopefully I will say enough that that it'll give people some thoughts. And I wanted to do this too because I think that the conversation is being generally mishandled. I think that there are a lot of influencers who are sort of on the team and probably being paid to be on the team. And one of the interesting things that I noticed over this past year was a lot of influencers telling people to sell or that they've already sold. Right. I don't know how many people have noticed this, but within the not the direct Bitcoiner influencer community, but people who are influencers who have mentioned Bitcoin in the past. But I saw one direct Bitcoin influencer talking about how, we've already peaked, at 70,000, because if you look at the ratios of peaks in the past and you assume that it's this geometric progression between the multiples, then, blah, 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 just kind of some numerical voodoo, in other words, right? Nothing to base it on, and nothing that explains, why it is that the peak last time may not have been higher after the Chinese mining ban. So, it occurred to me, are influencers being paid to encourage people to sell? And I started to think about this, and one of the things that I noticed was how much Bitcoin the finance blob has soaked up. And when I say finance blob, I mean, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, all that stuff. And we can, talk later on about who controls that. But I wanted to do a quick correction. There was a conversation with Whitney Webb and a couple of other people in finance, and one of them said, BlackRock has 0.21% of Bitcoin. And I think it was just like a quick grab the calculator and do a calculation. 0.21% doesn't sound like a lot, but that's wrong. BlackRock has, as of last week when I checked, 432,000 Bitcoin. So, a little under 500,000. And, that's more than 2% of the final supply of Bitcoin. So more than 2%. But when you consider that people have lost their keys and things like that, it's about 2.5%. But if you add up the whole financial blob, which is probably all controlled by one entity, and we can come back and discuss that point in a little bit, it's 1.1 million Bitcoin. And I think that that's about 6% of what you would, Bitcoin where keys have not been lost. In other words, effective Bitcoin supply. And that's a lot. That's quite a lot. And that made me wonder, should I get out of Bitcoin? Is it going to be a bad thing? Is it going to be used to be a bad thing? Technology is anything that makes the world more productive. Right. And we could debate whether or not something is a technology, but I think that the more interesting debate is whether or not it's a symmetric or asymmetric technology. Once you have a technology that can only be used by one side, I consider that a warfare technology. Right. It's like getting, better cannons or better planes or better boats or something like that. And suddenly it's an advantage that only you have. You can fight warfare in a completely different dimension. And considering things like the soft war thesis, I think that's basically correct, which is that you have wars that never take place just because of financial strangulation, and the way it is that people would hang themselves if they did go to war. But if you only have one side that is holding Bitcoin, then there's only one side that profits from that sort of finger trap that people might get into. So I did some thinking about this, and I thought, okay, in order for me to understand whether or not Bitcoin is good or bad, I want to do a couple of things. One is to try to separate it out from other cryptocurrency because it is distinct and it is different in some key ways. But then, go back to first principles, right? And examine what is Bitcoin. And this is the point at which, I would want to point out that Bitcoin, people talk about surveillance technology. We should be very concerned about surveillance technology. On the other hand, interesting thing about Bitcoin is that it's two-way surveillance, right? Not only, so if you have like 0.05 Bitcoin, if some family has, some fraction of a Bitcoin, okay, their transactions can be tracked by the governments. Of course, a lot of this assumes that Bitcoin is being used for common transactions, which I don't think that it will be. I think that it will be used more as like the banking currency. And this is where you get into Gresham's law. Gresham's law is where you have good money pushes out bad money pushes out good. And that's because Lord Gresham pointed out to the Queen, I think it was Queen Elizabeth I, that when she created a second coinage of lower base metal, when she debased the currency, that the reason that the old coins weren't traded in the marketplace is you would want to get rid of the new coins first because they're less valuable. They have less ability to do something else for you. If let's say you have two sets of coins, and each of them represents $1 per coin. The ones that you would keep would be the ones that you could melt down and make weapons or plows out of, right? They have some other purpose. So it's the less valuable thing that you will see transact in the marketplace. So if Bitcoin is the Gresham's law winner, if it is the ultimate, digital currency, then it is not the one that you will see commonly traded in the marketplace. Something else will be that currency that soaks up the vast majority of global transaction. So, thinking on that level, that's really not the biggest form of surveillance that we're worried about, right? The amount of data that is collected on us from every interaction that we have online, that's the kind of data that can, get to a level of, mind manipulation. Right? How it is that you advertise something to somebody, how it is you understand their moral structure in order to create dilemmas in their mind and wedge them toward, supporting this policy or voting for this person or something like that. That's the stuff that we're really worried about. So, just sort of going back to the basics, you have a symmetric ledger. And the more symmetric the technology, the more likely I am to think that it's going to be a good thing going forward in the future. So maybe we'll pause right there. I've got several more points to cover, but I just kind of wanted to see if that is a place that we wanted to stop and have some discussion.
Yeah, go ahead, Gabe.
Sorry, there are actually a lot of points I wanted to jump in on because for those who aren't familiar with me, I was very interested in Bitcoin as a freedom technology. Back in 2014, I was paying attention to it because I was a tech guy, really interested in what we can do to really advance liberty online. And there are a lot of, online freedom advocates, especially privacy advocates, who are really excited about Bitcoin in the early days. And unfortunately, over time, we've seen Bitcoin become less of a, ideal resistance currency, more into what people are calling kind of digital gold. And there's more discussions in that way. And a lot of people are asking, why are these big, institutional players that you mentioned earlier being a bigger part of that space? And to be honest, I lean more on the side where that's a very, pessimistic and nefarious sign. And I think we should go rewind all the way back to the start of this conversation is really about the election, because a big part of this is that I don't think cryptocurrency or Bitcoin, any of that moved people's votes in any big ways. But as far as how much influence can be bought in the system, that can be huge just from how much money is spent. And the golden sign of this fundamentally would be the fact that Elon is a big crypto advocate. He did the big Doge pump a couple of years ago, and he bought Twitter. And that was a big part of boosting many different things. But I would argue the cryptocurrency industry is going to benefit from this. And just how much did this whole Bitcoin, but even crypto industry impact the election, considering there's a lot riding on this? I think that if anything, there's a big fight over the regulations, there's freeing Ross, there's a whole lot, hanging on this. Some of it's more optimistic, some of it's more pessimistic. And so both of you, because you're both Americans one way or another, how do you feel about how the crypto industry was part of the election, part of the discussion, and how much does Trump's victory change that?
We'll have to see how much Trump's victory changes it. But I'll go ahead and mention this. There is a bill being proposed for the U.S. government buying 200,000 Bitcoin a year for 5 years, 1 million Bitcoin in the supply. And, I heard, Whitney Webb and a couple of other people discussing this. But here's what I'll say is this could actually be a plan to erase the U.S. debt. And this was one of the things that I thought Bitcoin might do back in 2017, which was to erase the U.S. debt. If you imagine right now, the U.S. has $35 trillion in debt. Well, if the U.S. dollar just gets inflated away, let's say it loses 90% of its value, I don't think that's going to happen immediately. I think right for the short term, the dollar is going to suck up value from other currencies as they fail. But in the long run, if we have Bitcoin replacing the dollar as a reserve currency, how many trillions of dollars of reserves is being replaced. And so you're going to get this massive, inflation effect. So let's say it's 90%. I'm just throwing out a number just for the sake of discussion. In today's dollars, maybe that 35 trillion in debt becomes 3.5 trillion, but that the Bitcoin that the government owns, 1 million Bitcoin, if Bitcoin goes to say 10 million, which is a discussed possibility within the community, well, 1 million Bitcoin would then be $10 trillion. And suddenly the government would have flipped its bankruptcy, and sure, it would have paid some for that Bitcoin. But then again, whatever is paying for it is also going to be, inflated away. So I think that strategically for the U.S., it could be a responsible and smart decision, just in the sense of looking at it from the perspective of the organism that is the United States federal government. So, that's a possibility right there. And that could be beneficial to the U.S. and to America. Now, one quick thing to say about the privacy angle is, even if Bitcoin does not provide great privacy, if it's used as a banking reserve, it doesn't need to be the technology that would do that. Something else could do that. You could have a privacy coin that is the one that's traded in the marketplace, right? And I suspect that there will be numerous coins trading in the marketplace, whether or not they're regular fiat currency, whether or not they're, just numbers on somebody's balance sheet like the Federal Reserve, or whether or not, regard of some cryptocurrency, right? So maybe I would say look for your privacy elsewhere. Just because Bitcoin doesn't do that for you doesn't mean that it's not still, a valuable tool in terms of creating an economic base.
Yeah.
Well, I would. Sorry. I would actually.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Go. I'd push back a bit about really the idea of, let's use a strategic reserve to keep the dollar afloat. That's a very popular idea that's kind of going around, especially in regards to that bill you brought up. And I think honestly, this is just a prediction here, but like I believe in the same way Bitcoin failed to be a resistance currency, I'm not optimistic about its ability to be digital gold long term. And just for the basis of saving the US dollar, I don't believe that any financial engineering to kick the can down the road, while it's been remarkably impressive at that, all of the attempts have kind of kicked things way longer than many people predicted. But the truth of the matter is, I feel like, and this kind of goes down into your passion, Matthew, about how we have this problem in society where all the higher minded things we want are downstream of the society itself. You need education, so you need workers, you need people who are actually able to develop new technologies. If we're just going to hold on to Bitcoin for dear life and hope it'll save us, that's not going to help us if the new Bitcoin comes around and eviscerates everything. I think one of the bigger problems we have right now, especially in North America, is that we basically have these cargo cults. And I see much of the crypto industry as its own cargo cult. And what's happening here is that there are many other investments that could be made if you actually wanted to save the dollar. And I feel a lot of that has to do with, the things you've mentioned bottom up about education. But like a big part of this is one of the edgier takes I have in this discussion is that I think much of the big collapse people have been warning about and freaking about for years, I think it's actually already happened. If you look at how much younger generations can earn, how much, how their career prospects are, what their access to information is. Because we have the internet, you can learn everything, but you can't get directed learning. You can't actually gain the useful skills that will allow you to compete on the bigger playing fields, which is why techno liberty is a big part of my personal focus, because I see this as a really big game about how do we actually rebuild human civilization after it's been under attack for so long. And I think there are many useful tools to do this, but I am kind of concerned that, especially when it comes to the Bitcoin strategic reserve, that sounds way more like a pump and dump story than an actual strategy on how you're going to rebuild the foundations, which is why, truthfully, I haven't paid too much attention to really much of the crypto space for so long, because you're not seeing those fundamental benchmarks. Are people being educated on how technology actually works? I wrote a piece about how misplaced optimism in blockchain is the road to hell in many of these spaces, because especially crypto wide, but it exists in Bitcoin too, where there are these people who believe they are tech freedom advocates. And in my opinion, they are so ignorant about the state of technology as it exists, they have no hope of improving it in the future. And that's very troubling to me.
Okay, let's put a pin in education, because that's my last point today. And it's a huge one.
Right.
It's so important, obviously.
I just want to go back to what you were saying, Matthew, as well. This idea of, not long ago, I had on the podcast retired wealth manager Clive Thompson, who spent almost half a century managing wealthy folks' wealth. And he brought this up and he explained this potential transition from getting rid of the old debt as we go on to this new sort of CBDC digital money system. And you sort of touched on that as well. And for me, it sounds like Bitcoin is the new gold, in the sense of how empires, we had the gold-backed dollar, and it's almost like now they're creating the Bitcoin digital gold-backed dollar. And what you were saying, as gold will be something that central banks hold on to, that people hold on to, and you don't really sell gold. Like the way I buy gold is I just buy it and I forget about it, and it's there, and in case I need it, I can bring it out again. And so would you think that's sort of an accurate assessment? So is that something that they're trying to do, where Bitcoin will have sort of the function as gold did when it backed the world reserve?
So I think this part gets a little bit complicated. One thing I want to mention is I'm not arguing for using Bitcoin to back the dollar or anything like that. I do think that there is some sort of a complicated plan going on where the two are being put into pools together. For instance, what backs Tether? Their reserves are partially in bonds and partially in Bitcoin, and they have several different things going on there. I think that's sort of a short-term plan, and I think that the ascendancy of Bitcoin within that stack is actually, a lot of how they will profit. But I don't think that you need to think of a dollar as being backed by Bitcoin. So I just, it's like maybe you could do it that way, or you could not do it that way. Maybe I'll just put it like that and say, let's just focus on what Bitcoin is without all those other plans, because however, Bitcoin comes to be, there are better ways to do it and worse ways to do it. And we can argue, and I'm happy to argue against those worse ways to do it. I'm against central bank digital currencies. That was one of the things that was a red flag for me with Steve Kirsch. The first time I talked with him about Bitcoin, he acted like he didn't know anything about cryptocurrency. And then I come to find out that he was the CEO of M10, which was a central bank digital currency company. But anyhow, did I don't know. I feel like I sort of half dodged, half answered that question. Gabe, what are your thoughts?
I mean, when it comes to the central bank digital currency discussion, I've been very concerned that there are, corptocracy ways of doing the same thing. You can have PayPal run all of the financial rails and it doesn't really matter what system you're under. I think the challenge when it comes to can Bitcoin replace, or compete with a CBDC, Bitcoin fundamentally does not operate as a big way as a currency right now. You talked about how Gresham's law means not many people are going to use Bitcoin for transactions. And what, for instance, here in Canada, we had the Canada Bank digital dollar proposal they were pushing out here. And I guarantee you many people would use that more than Bitcoin, even as a totally open option, for the same reason that here in Canada, we already use e-transfers. We already use the banking system to send money to each other easily. And the question is where does Bitcoin, if it has a place at all, fit in this ecosystem where transactions are already handled by one system or another? And truthfully, I think this is actually a really important point, because back when, Bitcoin was first launching and people were getting really excited about it, there were two problems Bitcoin was supposed to solve. It was supposed to solve central banking. It was supposed to, change the power imbalance that they can no longer just print money and take people's mouth away. It was by creating that savings vehicle, which is where the digital gold promise is still a big part of it. But the other side of it too was that it was also a low fee way to move money internationally. And that this actually relates to something you wrote, Matthew, about how could Bitcoin have been part of bootstrapping, the migrant crisis about at least at the southern border, where it's like Bitcoin could be used for remittances. But the thing I find interesting about this in hindsight is that had an expiration date. By definition, Bitcoin is a 10-minute auction on a set of transactions. And so fees are only going to be based off a dollar amount, inexpensive, while the price of Bitcoin is low. As the price of Bitcoin goes higher and the demand for transactions understandably increases, there will be a time where it cannot be used as a currency fundamentally at all, especially not for day-to-day transactions, but probably not even for a big chunk of transactions. And so that goes back into the question of, when it comes to how Bitcoin actually exists, was it always going to fail to a CBDC? Was it some kind of attempt to get all the energy, everybody focusing on, oh, this is the way out, this is the solution, but then in practice it has an expiry date that is right when the CBDCs are being launched? And fundamentally, corporations want that same market share as well. Facebook created, I think it was called the Libre. I don't know what they called their digital money proposal. And the truth of the matter is what made Bitcoin special, as somebody who got excited about it early days, was the idea that you actually had something decentralized. You actually had something that people outside the system were operating. But this is harder and harder an idea to sell when you've got mining is so consolidated. You have these giant ASIC farms that are running hardware that it's like, this isn't consumer hardware. You're not just having that lying around the house spare. The idea of one CPU, one vote is basically gone nowadays. And so that leads to real questions about the fundamental security of Bitcoin. But even if that's sacrosanct and there's no issues there, you also have the problem of the consolidation financially. You have all these big ETFs. You have all these big players buying it up, basically representing a big part of the business interests in the space. And they can run fractional reserves. The assumption is that they will fail, but there's a lot of financial rigging that can go on in the meantime, and a lot of people can kind of be out of luck. There's the whole Mt. Gox hack that happened, and that's a big concern I have, is that I don't think Bitcoin can deliver on its long-term promises. And to be blunt, part of it has to do because it failed as a currency.
See, I don't think this whole fail as a currency thing. I'm not sure why anybody would say that. If it's too expensive to I don't think that it will be too expensive to send a remittance. I think that what Bitcoin is the solution to an optimization problem. What is the least amount you can pay in terms of energy, which ultimately translates to everything economically? What is the least amount you can pay for a transaction? And for a secure transaction, right? I think that game theoretically, we won't see a large amount of censorship going forward because if you do have some sort of a monopolization over mining or something like that, the moment it is not censorship resistant, you will have a fork, and then you will have a one of those forks of Bitcoin will then be mined by people without all of the ASICs. Right. Or a fraction of the ASIC pool becomes as valuable as the whole ASIC pool. And the people, the 2/3 who censored or something like that are going to give up the value of their hardware instantly by doing something like pulling Russia from the SWIFT system. Right. So I'm not really worried about that. I'm not really worried about people, nerfing billions of dollars of their own hardware in order to stop people from sending remittances or anything like that. But and so this is an important part of the conversation. I feel like we are getting into the complexities of game theory that I mean maybe we should talk about it today. Maybe we have. Maybe I'll just go ahead and leave it there. But I don't see that as a big issue. Replacing the central banking. Well, that would happen at the reserve level, right? I feel like if it happens at the reserve level, if operating banks use Bitcoin, hold Bitcoin as their reserves, and they don't need something like an issuer of a dollar for their reserves, then that takes away a lot of the power of the centralized banks over localized banks. So I do think that it still depends on that. Now, what was Bitcoin supposed to solve? It may be that the whole low fee thing was a psyop. Maybe that was just how it was advertised in order to get people interested. Maybe that was only going to be true for the first 10 years, right? I'm not worried about it if it does, if it is the solution to the optimization problem. So, I think that, going forward in the future, you might use it to buy a car, you might use it to buy a house, but I'm not worried about whether or not you use it to buy coffee. So the low fee thing it just doesn't matter to me. Bitcoin in some sense might be, first of all, it looks a lot like Bancor when you stop to think about it. It's Bancor without the ability to, create the currency out of thin air. You have no mechanism for inflation. It's inflationary resistant. And with respect to the idea of a new Bitcoin coming along, if there is something that is left out of the Bitcoin recipe and somebody else begins a new blockchain or something like that, well, all the Bitcoin coders need to do is include that new piece to the code in the recipe, and people are going to be interested in sticking with a blockchain that's been around for 15 or 20 or 50 years rather than one that's new. Right, you have all that transaction history. You have all the energy over time. You're actually sort of building on the past expense of your security because it takes a lot of money to just unwind a few transactions. If you run a Sybil attack, if you run a 51% attack on the Bitcoin network, it would take just unimaginable amounts of energy to rewind 2 years back or 10 years back or something like that. You have this long store of history that I just don't think that people are going to want to, kick away. But, since we're talking about PSYOPs real quick, I'm going to throw something out, and this may change the direction of the conversation a little bit, which is that, since we're talking about the occult origins of Bitcoin, right? There are people who think the CIA created it. I think that when people focus on the CIA, this happens a lot in conversations. Why this one of the was it 17 different U.S. intelligence agencies? Why are we focused on the CIA? I actually think that it has more to do with the military because it's the military that is married to the bank. And granted, I think that all the intelligence agencies are sort of in with each other in a sense within the military occult banking syndicate. But the Knights Templar, go Game of Thrones, the Iron Bank and the Lannisters or whatever. A military needs a bank to pay it. A bank needs a military to protect it. Right? These things they're kind of married together. What Bitcoin does in some sense is becomes the marriage to the military without the need for the banking side. And I bring this up because its existence, unless there is some sort of hack to it, and I think that the quantum hack is totally fantasy, and we can come back and talk about that, but it's just not going to happen. You can always up the level of security, but one of the things that I thought in 2017 when I first was highly interested in Bitcoin was, you're not going to have like one of US and China accept this and the other one reject it. Back in the 1400s, when China had the treasure fleet and they burned their boats, they pretty much guaranteed that Europe would become the great power of the world starting a few decades later. You can't burn. What you don't want to be is the Luddite. What you don't want to be is the team that allows a technology to be asymmetric when you could have made it symmetric. And I say that out loud, at least partially. That's a message that I want to encourage people who are wary of digital currencies, central currencies. Think about that point. If you allow only the other side to learn technology, then you're putting yourself at a very great disadvantage. So I don't feel like I'm deflecting that, but I don't know if I've satisfied your question, Gabe.
I mean, when you mention changes, one of the things that stood out to me is the fact that historically the Bitcoin community has not been good at embracing changes that require hard forks, especially. Basically, every time they were given a road between a soft fork and a hard fork, they've taken the soft fork road. And this is really important to think about, because what that means is that the change that is possible, or at least historically done, is very limited. Now, in some ways, that's a good thing. In theory, then you have like this strong, basically constitutional backing of like, this is what it is. People can rely on that. But the other side of that coin is where I do think say a new crypto asset, a new Bitcoin, a new system of doing things comes onto the scene. Bitcoin is not nimble enough to adapt to new changes if significant changes are always going to be verboten, if they're never going to be able to adapt to things moving forward. But truthfully, I think the real boats being burned right now is the way governments have kind of turned hostile against their own citizens. And I'm not convinced the Trump election is going to totally reverse that, although many people are optimistic about it. I think the problem is that the boats that really exist fundamentally in this discussion is that technology is changing in big ways. We're seeing, warfare being disrupted by even commercial off-the-shelf drones. The most important asset right now is not AI, it's creativity. And that's interesting because that's one of the places that AI is notably useless at. And I think the governments are going to learn in a very short period of time. They have been neglecting all the investments they need to make by basically sabotaging their own people. And it's going to be a very rude awakening, because all the countries, for instance, the BRICS alliance that is talked about a lot here on Geopolitics and Empire, I don't necessarily believe they're better for being good for their people. But what's different is there's a more pragmatic, down-to-earth approach that at least, they have industries working, our offshoring was sent over to China and all these kinds of things, where like we have a problem right now where basically young people are begging for opportunities, begging for the ability to actually meaningfully participate in the economy, because what we have is all these weird smoke and mirror industries and, basically regime, finance of like anybody within the political system makes money for just being a part of it, not because they're actually creating a better structures in the countries or how things operate or even in industries. And it's such a weird thing to me, because I feel like energy is a big part of this discussion, where the whole net zero thing, it doesn't make sense to me as anything other than an attack on the public. And it's such a hard fight right now, because I think regardless of what technologies we want to use, we need to properly equip our citizens to be able to engage with that however it goes. And the fight seems to be right now is, we're just going to mandate we have to do this to you, instead of, here's how we can all learn to work with this. And this affects so many issues. Like one of the things I'm staring at the face right now is that there's like all these online safety issues for kids right now. And that's the most fundamental angle of you have to teach people how to live in the world that exists right now rather than just profiting off their suffering. And that's a hard fight right now, because I used to believe, for instance, that 90% of this was central banking. I honestly believed that the central banking model created a scenario where it made sense to profit off suffering, taking advantage of asymmetric technologies, as you say. But the thing is that I am convinced that, like, even that is not the whole story of how governments have kind of turned on their own subjects, population, whatever we want to call it. And anything that can be done to reverse that trend, I would say, is arguably more important than the next Bitcoin.
And I thought maybe just to jump in to bring this up, when you mentioned governments and control, Matthew, you mentioned CBDCs and a lot of people freaking out about that. I just had a startling experience recently, what happened to me here in Mexico. So I went to the bank to renew my debit card, which expired in October. I've been here for 14 years in Mexico, and I've been using the same documents to renew my debit card. And I've got, a few different bank accounts, and I was denied. And I saw this coming, and it's incredible because, I talk about the algorithm ghetto, and it was finally that day came. And it's a minor battle. So what happened was, I opened my account originally as a U.S. citizen with my U.S. passport. Then I became a Mexican citizen, so I had a Mexican passport. And subsequently, I'd been using, first it was my U.S. passport. I think even the last time I renewed, I successfully did it with my Mexican passport. And this time I come in, they require a valid government-issued ID, which is Mexican passport. And they said, no, you cannot renew your debit card. Why? Because you've got something called the Mexican voter card, the INE, Mexican voter card. And the bank told me, and the clerk was very nice. He was trying to help me, the executive. So, it wasn't him. It's the system. And he said that it's the Mexican government now who requires, I guess, the bank to use only the Mexican voter card ID to carry out, renewals and things like this. Because when you get the Mexican voter card, the INE, you give up your biometrics. And the clerk was telling me he tried to renew as a U.S. citizen. But then the system requires your Mexican visa. But I don't have a Mexican visa because I'm a Mexican citizen. So I can't do it as an American. I have to do it as a Mexican. And the only way now is through the Mexican voter card, ID card, which because you have to give your biometrics when you get it. And then that's what is used then to do your public or private services. And then I don't have the Mexican voter card because I never wanted to get it because I don't vote. Because I feel like it's again, I've mentioned this before, for me, it's a sham voting. And number two, because I believe that the INE, the Mexican voter ID, would be the basis for the national digital ID. And here we are now. And then I learned that the Mexican voter card is the most widely used because it's the most complete set of information. And then I found this article, Reclaim the Net, great website. They put out recently that the UN wants digital IDs to combat hate speech. And it says one of UN's Our Common Agenda plan proposals was to proposes bank account linked digital ID. So again, it's not even so much CBDC. So here I am being forced by the UN says this, the Mexican government is forcing now to link my bank account with the Mexican digital ID. And without it now, I cannot function. And so it was quite a shock last week to be told I cannot renew my debit card unless I go out and get the Mexican voter ID, which I've been staving off because I know that's going to be the core, right? So even, we can even forget about CBDCs right now. It's just digital ID linked to your bank account, linked to all other accounts. If you want to renew your driver's license later on or passports or whatever. So I just thought this was fascinating experience to bring up.
So, and ultimately you said all that without saying Bitcoin, right? Like all those things are very highly concerning. They're very highly concerning because the people are not participating. It does show that we are in a very difficult situation in the sense that there is an oligarch community that has more power than most of us would have even guessed a decade ago, right? And they're able to apply this power in a lot of ways that right now feel scary. And maybe we should reframe that problem, which is that the people who have the most power want weak citizens. So is there a chance that Bitcoin will flip the incentives will they at some point want stronger citizens? And I'm going to argue that might be the case, that Bitcoin might improve education. And Gabe, this was one of your big concerns. I don't think that Bitcoin is going to like fix this in terms of like just solve all the world's geopolitical problems all at once or anything like that. But one of the biggest problems in the world is that education is sabotaged. Right, it's one of the things that keeps people from crossing asymmetric boundaries of information, and to understand how to actually participate. I think that when Elon Musk says that we are living in simulations within simulations, what he is actually talking about is information boundaries, right? And so that is what it is. It currently exists. Our educations are very highly sabotaged. So where does a network derive its value? And I asked that question out loud because that's what Bitcoin is a network, right? And you can actually you can see Bitcoin's like gain in value over time in a similar way to Facebook's. There's something called Metcalfe's law. Metcalfe is a computer scientist, might be Latin America or South America, but he can't located there right now. He came up with this idea that a network is its value is in proportion. Its growth would be in proportion to the square of the number of users of the network. And this has been checked in terms of Facebook's growth and Tencent's growth in China, right? And then Bitcoin comes along, and Bitcoin seems to have a lot of similarity with those two when we look at it on a network level. So let's say that you're holding some Bitcoin. Let's say you're an oligarch trillionaire. You have $1 trillion worth of Bitcoin, and you go, well, how is it that my money would become more valuable? And the answer is for people to become more valuable who are on the Bitcoin network. If what you can do is raise somebody up who is impoverished and wouldn't even have savings, wouldn't own Bitcoin, if you can improve their education such that they become part of the network, a functioning part of the network, then you have expanded the network and you've expanded the value of your own savings currency. So the alignment of incentives could be a very, very good thing. Now, that's a long-term thing. That's a thing that we're going to have to, and it'll even involve like educating the oligarchs, maybe. Right? Maybe they do, maybe they don't get that point, right? But the moment you say it out loud, the moment you say, hey, whoever's pulling Elon Musk's strings, whoever's on that level above the simulations of simulations, your part of this world becomes more valuable now that we have this optimization solution, if you allow people to become educated. So, and now, the way some people think, it's their position in the hierarchy that matters most to them. But, you're over, that's an illusion. That's an illusion that they could possibly learn to understand why it is that it's less valuable to be the king in a poor world. Right? You go back, 500-600 years, even members of royal families didn't live as long as we live now, right? Their healthcare wasn't as good. Their lives were not as comfortable. They're not recognizing that in a, very abundant, peaceful world that their lives are better, whether or not they're the king. And so, there may be, some sort of an education that needs to take place about networks in order for people at the top to recognize that even if they're risking losing position, that the incentive now is for them to work with the rest of the world and not try to dominate the rest of the world like a psychopath.
Well, that reminds me of the conversation I had with you, Havore, on the network stage when I was on with you in TNT radio. And that's kind of the proposal here. The proposal here on some level is that governments are evil and tyrannical. And so if we create these private pseudo-voluntary associations, that you can, in theory, create a better governance model out of that. I wonder how much Austrian economics is kind of compatible with that. Bitcoin's hard money, gold's hard money. And I wonder if part of the problem in this, transition, however we want to phase what's going on right now, I wonder if there was an economic problem in switching, even if, Matthew, you're right, that at some hypothetical end stage, that a sound money system or something approaching that direction can actually yield better incentives. But does that necessarily mean the shift is easier, works well within that direction? Because what seems to be happening, at least from my, I don't pay too much attention to geopolitics itself beyond this show. It really does seem like people are scrambling to be king, no matter how poor the country is. And again, I used to blame that entirely on central banking. More and more, I start to wonder how much of it is the narcissism, the psyops, weird cult operations going on. And why I'm most concerned about the network state model fundamentally is that I think it's a way for people to step away from many serious fundamental responsibilities. For instance, I'm a Canadian. It would be great to wash my hands of the entire Canadian history and just be like, oh, I'm starting fresh now. But the challenge is I'm going to be honest, if we want something approaching justice on many different issues, we kind of have to deal with the systems we were born into. And I think there's this problem where like governments are, I have a lot of issues with the Canadian government and how many governments are run, but there are important, I would say milestones of, liberty that we have kind of accomplished that I would be very concerned about letting go just because, there's some guy with an app that says if we join his new country, everything's going to be better. And I think it's very important that in many discussions, these whole ideas get blurred. The idea that Bitcoin can create some sovereignty on bigger or smaller scales is an interesting idea, but then people will also use that as an idea to kind of broker legitimacy for the idea that, we should all join Johnny's network state and let him control everything because it's in theory, voluntary or whatever. Like I have these problems with the fact that many different discussions, and it comes to fruition in the whole blockchain space. Many, blatant crypto scams only make sense because old people can go to Bitcoin ATMs and deposit their dollars, get Bitcoin, and then hand it over to the scammers. And I think actually that's probably the real reason why the crypto industry was so behind Trump is not because he mightn't even be that great for Bitcoin, but there was talk about how he's going to change over the SEC head and how that's going to loosen some regulations. And so if you have people doing like legitimately evil and terrible scams as a way of fleecing people as a plunder operation, if he's better for that, it kind of doesn't matter how good he is on Bitcoin, as long as he's creating a scenario where the plunder can continue and the really just evil machinations of trying to dispossess people so that, again, you can be that king of that really poor country. That does seem to be the inevitable result of where this is heading.
Just what you said on this idea of city states, I sometimes wonder if those are just elite experimentations or whether they're really trying to create, Pan Am, Hunger Games, Maze Runner districts. I got to hang out with Vit Jedlička, the president of Liberland, when I was in Acapulco earlier this year. And that seems to be one example, one iteration. You've got, Trump talked about freedom cities. So they're just, my fear with the Trump administration, he's just repackaging, a lot of the stuff we've all been worrying about since forever. Matthew, you tweeted about digital ID and how the right and the left are pushing it. Many other people are talking about that. Back in 2021, I had on leftist Todd Miller, who wrote a great book about the border industrial complex. And he said it's a bipartisan effort and that actually it's being scaffolded globally to create this literal prison planet. And I did just want to go back for a second, what you guys think about, we're all aware to some extent on technocracy and its history, right? 1920s, 1930s. Elon Musk's, grandfather, head of Technocracy Canada. What do you guys think on this idea of, they talked about energy certificates back then. So sort of to get rid of money and that everything, the currency would be energy certificates, which would sort of manage everything. It seems in some ways we are headed in that direction. Do you have any thoughts on whether Bitcoin maybe is a push towards that original plan of becoming some sort of energy certificate? And, there seems to be some connection with the green energy agenda. It's all a bit of a blur now. I feel like we're in this fog of war, but you can kind of see different scenarios. Any thoughts on that?
I think Bitcoin is in some sense already an energy certificate. It is the process of turning energy more directly into security in order to secure a money supply. So, one thing I'll say about that is whether or not, we can throw out a word like technocracy. And when we do, we're describing this cabal, the oligarchs and their cybernetic plans. And I'm not a fan of their cybernetic plans. But let's not let that color all technology, right? If Bitcoin does manage to secure money of the world using less energy, then, and if it doesn't use less energy, people are just going to use something else, right? Like nobody's going to use the one that costs more to run. So it only exists insofar as it is an optimization solution. I'm just not worried about that, right? That's not the thing that I'm worried about. When wars happen, and sometimes in the middle of a war, new technology is invented, and then the war ends, I don't say I'm not going to use that technology because it was something that happened in the middle of a war between, people that I didn't like or something like that. So this is part of the reason I wanted to, early on in the conversation, go back to the first principles of what is this, and let's disassociate it from anything that we can disassociate it from. On the other hand, I think that it was inevitable that Bitcoin's ascension would involve a lot of nefarious characters. Because if we do have nefarious oligarchs, and all of us here agree that we do, then the moment Bitcoin exists, the moment it looks competitive with anything in the system, all of those people are going to begin paying attention to it, right? Like I said, we could see the U.S. military, and I'm not saying the U.S. military is entirely nefarious. Most of the people there are good people, but the point is, anyone with power starting to pay attention to it means that it is useful to somebody for some reason. And I hope that means that it's going to save the world energy. The first killer app for Bitcoin was really Silk Road, right? People trading weed, other things too, but primarily weed, right? And in fact, a number of the wealthy Bitcoiners that I have met over the years at meetups and various things were either buyers or sellers on Silk Road, and they're the ones of that pool of people who recognized what it could be long term and thought it through and kept it, right? They just sat on it for as long as they could, over the years. So there are different types of oligarchs, and some of them just want to make they don't know better than to just make everybody into slaves and get the most out of the slaves that they can. But then there are other models for people who are at the top, and one of those is the robber baron, right? The robber baron recognizes that there is a need to play toward the equilibrium of a community to keep it relatively stable, to keep it relatively safe. One of my favorite shows, I don't watch a lot of television, but a number of years ago on HBO was a show called Deadwood. And you've got these, two competing brothel owners in the community. And one of them is just not very forward looking. The other one, he does want to, keep the community safe. Sure, he's going to rob people. Sure, he's going to scam people, might even murder people in the process. At the same time, he wants the community to succeed. And it's a step up mindset. And that's the person that I think is more likely to survive that competition long term. And that's the person that is more likely to buy into something that actually flips their own power base over time, right? They can live a better life. They can live, the life better than the king by buying into the thing that's new. So I guess, I'm just, that's not the level that I'm, that's not the level that worries me. If there are nefarious people involved, that actually doesn't worry me. It actually tells me that there's a chance that it succeeds. That doesn't mean that I want all of these other things, like smart cities or private corporate kingdoms or something like that. I'm going to go ahead and just not discuss those. I'm going to shrug my shoulders and say, we can discuss whether or not those could be good or must be bad or something like that. And I'm not sure that they are necessarily all bad. I do think that the way that it's being imposed on people right now is bad. It does feel like it's a control grid that is not for everyone's benefit. But, I think that's still, it's something that can be separated from the question of Bitcoin. Bitcoin can happen. And Bitcoin, and if it's bad, Bitcoin may undo that, because it may be that if you're competing with other places around the world that, like I said, where people are more free, and I think that freedom and education go hand in hand. I do think that there's a lot to the theory of Egypt growing up into a vast civilization, had to do with the fact that they had planting season, harvest season, and season up in the hills where they're playing in the sand with ruler and compass, right? I think that's where the Masonic religion sort of comes from at its roots. As much as I dislike a lot of things that go on in the Masonic circles, that is like that's the cool thing that happens with humanity because of freedom. And so, the question is, can Bitcoin exist in a way that aligns interests rather than promotes hierarchy? I've questioned a lot of things. I'm worried when I go to meetups. 7 years ago, it was the case where everybody was encouraged to beat on Bitcoin. Everybody was encouraged to criticize Bitcoin. And one thing that worried me during the pandemic, the pandemonium, was that when I would ask questions, questioning things like, that looks like there's a lot of military to this, which would make sense. And maybe I'll come back and mention why that'll make sense. I would get pushback. Like, it seemed like there was less of an intellectual discussion and more of a fanboy discussion going on. But even then, maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe it only matters that it does, rise to the point where it can serve as a reserve.
And I would say my biggest concern, regardless of Bitcoin's projection, whether for doom or for greatness moving forward, my big concern is that there is a level of ignorance about various digital matters. The reason why digital ID is something they're reaching for is because authentication is a problem they haven't quite solved, and the corporations are like, oh, we're going to give you authentication with identification, and then there's like all those interests working together to kind of make that happen. And I fundamentally believe that many of the problems we're facing right now are two major problems: a lack of imagination to find different paths, because all the people making the money coming up with paths are working for, the slavers, as one would say. And the other side of it is a real knowledge problem. For instance, my frustration in whether it's a blockchain space, whether it's even, this digital ID and technocracy space and CBDCs discussions, the ignorance people have over how these systems fundamentally work creates opportunities for psyops, scams, tyranny, abuse, all that thing. Because how many people were okay with social media censorship when they didn't understand it? I would say quite a lot. And this has so many other knock-on effects to other issues. And I believe a big part of the discussion right now is that we have a great opportunity to actually rebuild the foundations of our digital infrastructure, whether we're running Bitcoin or not, whether we're running other systems, it doesn't matter. And I think it's that process of rebuilding the foundations is what liberty-minded individuals need to focus on. We don't need to worry about what is the next app that's going to save us. It's how are we going to rebuild a foundation that isn't routed entirely through Langley or other NSA data centers. It's like, how do we restructure our digital landscape so that it can't be weaponized against people? Because I feel like everything we've inherited right now was just built by big tech for convenience. They wanted the big social media sites. They wanted to make money off these things. And I actually think we're going through something I want to write is called the tech apocalypse, where right now you've got these antitrust cases against Google. And so I'm predicting we're going to see big tech and many of these things that we thought were like unstoppable kind of being unraveled. And we have to be very careful about what they're being replaced with, regardless of what the ultimate direction is. And so I think it's very important to be engaged, but also learn whatever you can. One of the most exciting things right now, and I'm suspicious about what's driving it, but truthfully, a lot of young people are getting interested in assembly. And that's great, because if you understand
interested in what?
code, assembly programming. So like when you understand what the machine is actually doing, then you can start rebuilding those foundations. And I think anything you can do to pique either your own or other people's curiosity on these topics, to delve deeper than just the public discussion. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about Bitcoin. It doesn't matter if we're talking about digital ID. If you can actually peer into the discussion and realize the limits of what various people are talking about, that will put you ahead on really any issue. Nobody has time to look through everything, but as a group, as a community, as people you know and trust, building up that capacity is completely invaluable. And I think that is the most important way out of this digital technocracy that many of us are becoming increasingly concerned about, whether or not Bitcoin is the answer.
So, there are some concerns. Okay. You've brought up scams 2 or 3 times now. One thing that I just want to say immediately, no, it's fine. It's fine. It's a really important part of the discussion, right? I mean, we should talk about scams. And, I ran a Bitcoin education, Signal chat group, and that was, often part of the conversation because I wanted people to learn to recognize scams, right? Like what's going on here. I would tell people, invest in almost nothing in this space, like 99.9% of it's scammy. But here's the thing, even if you add all those little scams together, right, they're a tiny drop in the bucket compared to the scams that have been run through the traditional finance system, right? It's so the comparison is just, it's night and day, right? Just in inflation itself, just the ability to print money, is more scam than may ever exist in the entire cryptocurrency, industry and rails. And there are people who say that Bitcoin is just one big intended bubble and that there will be some giant rug pull. But they're never quite explaining in a way, at least that I hear, like what the story is behind that. Like, we should be concerned. We should think it through. And that is why we should beat on the system and have these conversations about it. I would like to know how that scam occurs, but just like, in terms of scams, like, people should put it in perspective, educate yourself about the scam. And maybe that's a forced education, right? Maybe it's, if you don't educate yourself, you will be ripped off left, right, and center, going into the future. So maybe that is part of the, pushing the button that is short-term pain, but maybe long-term prosperous for the average person.
That was actually my next question. I just want to get your guys' thoughts on to explore this scenario of Tulip Mania, what you just brought up. What if Bitcoin ends up being, whether it was planned as Gabe mentioned earlier, whether it was baked into the cake or programmed or not, it just ends up being Tulip Mania, because that's one of my, just one sign that I see. The way it skyrockets in price is alarming for me. But again, like I said, I'm out of my depth when it comes to Bitcoin. But any thoughts on Tulip Mania for Bitcoin and what it would mean if it actually happened? What just thoughts there?
Well, if it gets replaced by a better technology that makes the world even more prosperous, then, sucks for the people that got hurt, but, don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? If it happens for that reason, good. Mostly. If it happens because there's a backdoor, right? We should be taking a look at SHA-256, right? We should be asking tough questions like, are we sure that we know that nobody has a way to bounce from one seed to another in a predictive way? We should make, but you can always upgrade security. You can always layer. You might have multiple different factions choose layered security, right? And so, I'll throw that out. Maybe that's a BIP that should be discussed for Bitcoin, is changing the actual cryptographic security algorithm in order to upgrade it against attacks. Maybe it is that governments take control of all the hardware, but like I said, if they take control, if there's just a fork and then people can mine with a Raspberry Pi, people will mine with a Raspberry Pi. In fact, one of the brainstorm sessions that I had was people can and maybe should have little devices that replace their smartphones. Like, I want to get rid of smartphones anyway, but something that's like a BlackBerry where you've got, a type pad or whatever, but it is also sending and receiving communications. So it is participating in a meshnet gossip protocol. This is something that was already explored during, Venezuela's crisis like 5-6 years ago, where people were trying to set up mesh networks in order to be able to communicate, over distance while the government was pulling the rug on communications. I think that that if you receive a little bit of cryptocurrency from a transmission that moves through your node in a mesh network, then ultimately people have an incentive to walk around with these devices, but also, tweet out and, do whatever, send an email, whatever it is that you're doing. I think that those devices could even be like a fail-safe, a fallback. Great if the people with the ASICs want to give up their power to control the mining, then suddenly people who have less efficient machines will just take on the mining, and if they can get a hold of ASICs, it'll go back in that direction. But it just means the people who had the ASICs wasted money on them.
And I would say, as far as like, you mentioned various like black swans, like a hack, like, some kind of exploit found one way or another, to kind of build up what you said about layering security. I mean, the ecosystem matters. It kind of doesn't matter how great Bitcoin is if people are using wallets that are fundamentally broken or insecure one way or another. The ecosystem itself as a whole absolutely matters. And as an, pseudo outsider of the space, I have been quite disappointed in how that's all metered out. But truthfully, the other problem I see, as far as like, what if it's, just Tulips 2.0 kind of discussion, is that much of the bull case for Bitcoin is inflation. People are arguing that it'll, be a good shield against inflation long term. Now, at least in the recent short past term, it's kind of matched that. But the question is under severe deflation conditions, for instance, if geopolitical tensions rise and there's a war, yes, war is inflationary, but I'm sure at least suddenly, but especially in the early days, there will be deflationary forces and many other desires to do deflation. For instance, controlling the public so they can't spend money has deflationary pressures on assets and many other things. That's how these kind of systems work. So I've told you, Matthew, years ago that, like, I believe Bitcoin, if it has a space at all, it's best suited for the middle ground between total tyranny and total control. Total tyranny and total freedom. Because if you're in total freedom, you kind of don't need Bitcoin. You can just use your banks because they respect your rights or whatever. But then if it's total tyranny, well, they're not going to let it exist if it has any good properties at all. And so I worry that, depending, like, I'm Canadian, I'm more pessimistic about these things. I do think the closer we get to that total tyranny, that bull case gets weaker and weaker, because even your ability to operate within that ecosystem really suffers. Like, I think part of the reason why the crypto industry rallied behind Trump is that things did get quite bad with the Samurai wallet devs being developed, arrested. There's many desires to really crack down on any independence in this entire ecosystem. And I do think that alone could collapse really the entire justification for the space. And so it is very important that people, regardless of what they feel their ideal solutions are, that you're being very careful how your, governments, but even other actions you're taking are enabling those to destroy what little freedom remains.
Yeah, when you say like total freedom and total tyranny, immediately in my mind, I'm just like, that's not really the way that the world works. Like, your bank isn't going to respect everything about you without an incentive to, right? And this is the thing that I like about Bitcoin, still, is that it changes the incentive game, right? It's still like a relative, would you prefer, what we have right now, which is just, numbers moving around spreadsheets that are held centrally, or would you rather, and then all the expenses on the military that enforces that, right? Because if everybody around the world stopped using the dollar, suddenly there would be so many dollars in circulation that it would lose a lot of value very quickly. That's what the equation of exchange, shows us pretty simply. Whereas, if you have something that encourages, you want something that encourages people to respect your rights, and the less that costs, the more pressure it puts on the people who want to take your rights away.
Could I ask for fun if, Matthew, what you're saying, Bitcoin is going forward, price projections? We listen to people like Max Kaiser, it seems like he's having his day in the sun now as Bitcoin. It's going to hit 100 grand. I wager. Reports this week are different. Banks and stuff are saying it's going to hit 100 grand. I think some have talked. I think he said 220,000, if I wasn't mistaken, was one price projection by Kaiser. And I'm just using him as an example. I think some people may have said even $1 million for a Bitcoin. Do you have any thoughts, given what we've discussed, these different scenarios of how Bitcoin might be used by governments, by the international system, what the price could go to?
Well, short term or long term, I think short term, I think 200,000 to $1 million, pretty short term. Once people realize how hard it is to get a hold of any Bitcoin at all, when you have both the finance blob and the US government buying, right? And people see how quickly it's going up. People I think that the chance for a run on very little supply becomes higher. Longer term, right now people buy into ETFs. And people put a lot of money in 401ks and things like that. What people call hyper Bitcoinization, I don't think this is always explained very well, but think about the incentives. You wouldn't want to put. You can buy the market by buying Bitcoin in the future. If Bitcoin becomes the reserve, it will grow in value according to the growth of global world wealth. That's sometimes called the technological factor of an economy, right? The value of Bitcoin will grow according to demand for that fundamental capital. And so you wouldn't, if what you wanted was like your safe investment that is that mixes all risks, that pools all risks together. It will become the low volatility asset. So you wouldn't buy bonds. You wouldn't put money in a mutual fund. And right now in the status quo, and this is a really good thing too, right now in the status quo, ETFs screw everything up. They're good in a certain way, right? You buy into an ETF and you're doing better than if you're buying the basket of stocks or something like that. You are avoiding fees. You're lowering your volatility, right? The ETFs have outperformed market purchases that way. However, what the ETFs do is they create the financial blob, and you no longer have your voting rights, right? People don't have control over these corporations anymore, and so these financial blobs. And I mentioned earlier. I think that there's one entity that has control over all of this. And, we don't even know, is it, like the US government shadow sovereign wealth fund, or is it the British Empire? Is the Venetian British Empire? That's the reason I've been exploring this question a lot. But we saw lockstep. We saw corporate wokeness happen all at once. I mean, all at once. It's too freaky for that not to be coordinated. And so I think that ETFs helped that happen. But Bitcoin would soak up those ETFs as well. People would stop putting money in a lot of those things. I think that right now the stock market is in a huge bubble, and that it will help deflate that bubble, and that will help temper corporate power a great deal. And corporate power is the reason why globalism right now has an excess amount of tyrannical power over people who just want to run their nations the best way they can. So, I'd love to hear arguments against that, but it feels to me like it pushes back against that blob. Sorry, I went on a little winding path because I had to think through some of that real time. What was the start of that path?
Just
a long-term price.
Yeah.
Were we just talking about long-term price? Yeah. Once you start thinking how much money is invested in all those things, you start to add it up. There was a conversation very early on between Satoshi Nakamoto and Hal Finney, where Hal Finney said, 100 to 300 trillion. And I think he's looking at what is the capital stock base, the stuff that would just be held in money after hyper Bitcoinization. So let's take the middle, 200 trillion. And a little bit less than 20 trillion coins out there being active. That's a little bit more than a $10 million per coin price in today's dollars. So I think that that's possible. Yeah, I think that's possible.
And with these very exciting figures, I would also point out that Bitcoin is volatile. You probably could see 40K again. Who knows what happens? I'm not definitely somebody who's got to say, oh, rush out, mortgage your house like Michael Saylor did at one point, I believe. It's the kind of thing, it is important that whatever your strategy is, you're doing something that is within your ability to maintain over time.
I'm going to push back against the Bitcoin is volatile. I actually think that it's not. I think that, one, I do think that there have been controlled price moves. In fact, I think we're still in that era. That era will stop if the U.S. government starts buying. But if you log normalize the Bitcoin price chart, it's going to look like an upward sloping line with just some noise around it, right? Like when people go, well, there's more volatility. Okay, well, how do you measure volatility? Volatility doesn't make sense when you're looking at something on the beginning of the climb of the steep part of an S curve. You're not looking at like Brownian motion or anything like that. What you're looking at is the development of perception in an early technology, right? You're looking at waves of participation, chatter welling up and dying down in one space at a time. Ultimately, if you compare Bitcoin's price movement to Facebook's before it IPO'd, if you value the company according to the cash investments, it actually doesn't look that different. So historically, it just looks normal for a new network technology.
I meant volatile in the sense that it's not going to be a straight line up to the 200 trillion number. It's going to have some bumps. Like I said, I honestly don't think it's unreasonable to see 40K again, depending on what crazy nonsense happens over the next couple of months, years.
Well, it would take the financial blob dumping. We're not going to see those lower numbers again unless the big entities that have moved into play dump, and why would they? Right, like
margin requirements.
No, I mean, like the margin requirement would only happen if the dump happened first.
Yeah, so if stocks go down and then they have to dump their Bitcoin because they're holding on to so many stocks and these kind of things, that was one of the arguments about gold going down. And that reminds me of something I wanted to mention in this conversation, is that one of the propositions for Bitcoin and why it's important is counterparty risk. And that's one of the big questions. I think you wrote an article one time about how you can't protect yourself from counterparty risk in the market. If you're in that market, you can't bet on it failing. And I think in some ways, maybe those trying to expose themselves to Bitcoin, if they do that in the market, they could be trying to make that impossible bet, which is a recipe for pain in that sense.
Yeah, I think the further we go actually toward an unstable environment, I'm not worried about margin calls forcing State Street to dump Bitcoin. They have so much capital that's provided for them by so many wealthy people, right? They're not, they don't have to operate with significant amounts of leverage. But in a world in which things are breaking down financially, how is it that you get a boat through the Panama Canal, right? When the 2008 financial collapse happened, right, that was one of the real big questions about global trade. Was you had boats start to stack up at the Panama Canal and couldn't go through because banks were no longer accepting each other's letters of credit. With Bitcoin, you don't need a letter of credit. You just, boom, you zap it through. So long as you can send a transmission, you're fine. I think that Bitcoin will act counter to a lot of the forms of chaos that we're talking about. Anything that's going to make the stock market start to dive steeply. Well, where is it that people are going when they flee with that capital? Yeah, currently in the status quo, more of that money is still moving into bonds, sure. But more and more that money is moving into Bitcoin. And I think that eventually Bitcoin, I think it already is, people just don't know, but Bitcoin is eating into the value of gold. And I actually think that this is why we're seeing such a weird world of gold right now. If you get in line at Costco, last 2 times I've been there, there's been somebody like walking around with a bar of gold trying to sell it to people in line. Like they're shilling gold at Costco, right? Who owns Costco? I can't remember the guy's name, but that's like buddies with Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett. These are people who understand where the world's going. And Warren Buffett has moved into Berkshire Hathaway has almost $300 billion in cash on the sidelines. And I think about this. Well, he's not buying gold with any of that, right? But here's another story. Here's one. Have you guys read Currency Wars?
Oh, I think I've got the book right behind me, man. That was, I think, a decade ago. Yeah.
Yeah, well, more than a decade ago. And James Rickards is writing that book while Bitcoin is being developed, right? So he doesn't mention Bitcoin in the book, but he mentions, financial wargaming at the Pentagon. And at the beginning of that financial wargaming, they predict that Russia dumps U.S. treasuries and buys gold, right? And I've thought about this a lot. And I've thought about whether or not that's just a way to slough off what is going to be a devalued asset on Russia. Right. It's unclear what everybody's doing and why they're allowing gold to move around and all, in the ways that they currently are. Are the oligarchs really allowing for different pools of people to have their own gold reserves the way that they didn't want that to happen in the past? I think gold may be sloughed off onto people because it will be an asset that's devalued over the next decade because Bitcoin will be soaking that up. Because the precious metals, because they can be held in reserve, have excess value relative to the way they would just be used ordinarily in the markets.
Just on gold, I was going to mention, I've had a number of guests on recently talking gold, and I just thought it was instructive on, if we think for over a century now, gold was what, a century ago, $35 an ounce, and now it's nearing 3,000, and it hasn't gone down. It's always maintained its value and been going up. And one of my guests, Indian guy who's got a great book whose name I can't pronounce, said, it can hit 24,000 an ounce. Jim Rickards has said something to that same tune as well. The wealth manager I had on, Clive Thompson, in the near term has talked about it going to 5,000-6,000. But I think the point there, Bitcoin, I think, functions in that same way for now. And as you're explaining it, if it's not Tulip Mania, it will just it won't be losing its value. So neither is gold, neither is Bitcoin. But just what you mentioned about gold, though, there's a number of people saying that it wouldn't be the case what you're saying, that gold is returning to the fold. John, can't never pronounce his last name. I think he's from Netherlands. John Nieuwen Huiges, he's a veritable figure on gold. He says that we can point to Europe preparing for a coming gold standard. Ambrose Evans Pritchard, who writes for The Telegraph, who's a respectable figure, he talks about gold rally signaling a coming global dystopia. And precisely as you said, the Eastern Bloc backing up the truck on gold. And then you had the Russian Ministry of Finance, again, this is just a couple days ago, announced a significant increase in its daily foreign currency and gold purchases. And I think this is historic in some sense. It's a 35.5% jump from the previous period. And the other article that said, in a significant milestone that underscores Russia's commitment to precious metals, the country's gold reserves have surpassed 200 billion for the first time, reaching a record 207.7 billion. So, I can see it going either way, as you say, Matthew, but also there seem to be strong signs pointing towards gold sort of returning to its previous position. I don't know.
Okay, so one thing I'll say is the value of gold has gone up somewhat over the past 100 years, but not in the this talking about $35. Well, that's not today's $35, right? What will it buy you in the marketplace? That has improved, but it's only improved because of technology improving how efficiently we produce things. So I just want to point out that one piece. It hasn't. I think its value was more suppressed in the medium term. I think that the short term rises, and I told people at March 2020 on my Facebook, I was like, if you want in gold, buy right now. I was like 1,600 or something like that. But and I can't blame anybody for, if you're a Bitcoiner, maybe it's smart to hold a little bit of gold because there is a competition going on there. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Bitcoin will be killed or hacked in some way, in which case, gold will probably go up even more sharply because the two of them are competing for the same sort of status, like which one is the better hard currency. So, maybe some people in gold would want to hedge some with Bitcoin. So I can see that argument. But the short term signals like gold going up now, well, Bitcoin's going up faster, but then again, I would say Bitcoin's going up faster because it's at the bottom of the S curve as an adoption of technology. So, I don't think these point to the direction that the world's going. I think that they point to, short-term price action according to perception. It is the case, though, that people are reaching for harder assets in a world that's more uncertain and in a world that there are a lot of signs that we're heading toward war. I think that that's the easier thing to say, that there are signs of. One of the things that I did when I went to the Bitcoin conference, when I met people from, especially from foreign countries, there was a guy from the UAE who asked me to take his picture with the people he was traveling with. And I stopped and said, do you think we're going to World War? And he said, yeah. But I asked like 5 or 6 people that same question during the week. There are changes going on. People are reaching for more certain assets. I think that a more certain asset, is land. Especially if it's someplace that you can, have a garden, grow some food. If there are difficult times, one of the best ways to get past them is to be a little bit more self-reliant. But, long term, we just have to think about how it is that we're going to do education better. And that's going to allow better participation in the economy and allow people to climb above, the layers of simulations set up by the oligarchs.
Yeah. And touching on
before you get started, maybe I should take that moment to say this. And I want my Bitcoiner friends to know this, like mind control is more of the bigger problem. And Bitcoin doesn't solve that alone. It may in the long run through aligned interests in education, like we talked about. But, there is still an issue of people climbing through these sort of psyops that have been handed down to us from false history. And that's something that we have to do socially and with education.
Yeah, and I don't have a strong position on, where its gold's headed in the long or short term. But I will say one of the advantages that small amounts of any commodity, but precious metals are best known for it, is that if you have that, you can kind of give that out like cash. It's the kind of thing that unfortunately giving someone Bitcoin requires them to have a wallet. But if you're, already have a trusted relationship with someone, local transactions can be done on a precious metal basis. And I think that's why a lot of people who are kind of in the, exit and build space are very interested in Bitcoin, Monero, and precious metals, all these kind of things that allow you to transact outside of that. And the advantage of, precious metals, especially smaller, barterable amounts, is that at least there's no record of that. So then all the privacy risks that one may be concerned about digital currencies basically aren't there. But again, there's always the counterfeit issue. So logistically, it does require trust.
Well, and there's a robbery issue, right? I mean, you have the ledger for transactions on a basic level for the average transaction for buying a bicycle or something like that. Having a record for transaction works in your favor if what you want is honest play, right? But carrying around, a gold coin, you're more likely to have a gun in your face, right? So And that's not to say that I don't want people to have some sort of a medium to exchange things, but I don't really think that that's an advantage to gold and silver in a big way. It's especially not an advantage, though, when you consider international trade, right? Nobody wants to move around the amount of money that it takes to purchase a tanker full of oil, not in gold. That's not what you don't want to carry that gold. You're just you have a target on your back, right? And it's heavy. It actually takes a lot of energy to move that around. It's not convenient. So, we have to admit the inconveniences and all the inefficiencies of these past systems of transaction. This is why the story of the Rye Stones, I can't remember what island it was. Maybe it was a Polynesian island, and some British guy was shipwrecked and found himself on this island where they made large transactions, like buying somebody else's hut or home using one of these giant, donut shaped rocks. Right, like these things aren't going to be stolen. They're not going to be forged. They can't be counterfeited or whatever. They're not going to be moved easily. And really, the system of transaction was everybody on the island gathering around the stone and somebody going, "The stone is now Bob's," and we're exchanging houses over this. But to create one of these giant donut-shaped rocks, you would go to another island, pull it out of a quarry, bring it back on a raft, and people were sometimes killed. Right? There was proof of work. There was proof of that energy.
Well, we could still have issues with Bitcoin. I pulled up this story from when was it? This was August. 11 Israelis visiting Costa Rica were attacked by 8 men who overpowered their security guard and robbed them of $700,000 worth of Bitcoin. Analysis of surveillance footage leads investigators to suspect the robbers are current or former police. So I think with whatever source of wealth in general, you could have this issue,
Yeah, and I've heard some of these stories. One, I suspect that this is still like scams. It's probably such a minority of crime that I'm not sure that it's worse in some way. Now, also, there's no reason for you to carry around $700,000 in Bitcoin that you could immediately transact from your phone. That's insane. Right. And maybe it's one of those learning lessons. Did somebody actually do that? Is it a fake story? I think a lot of these stories are fake. Guy, goes to dumpster to find his laptop or something like that. Like, who's checking what the story actually is? But, I have a look through wallet on my phone. Yeah, I can see, the larger of my Bitcoin accounts. I keep a small amount on my phone for transactions, but walking around with $700,000 in your pocket, I mean, that has nothing to do with Bitcoin. That's a target on your back.
Are there any other avenues to explore, things that we haven't touched that you guys think are key or important to Bitcoin, crypto, the military, occult, banking, syndicate?
Well, one of the things I think is interesting to kind of ask and delve deeper in is, especially as far as the blob, as you mentioned it, you've got this group of people who are investing. I was doing a deep dive on Odyssey's new direction. They're calling it, they're using the Arweave token. They're building a new system on top of it. And I'm noticing not only DeFi, but decentralized technology is very much sucked into this blockchain cargo cult ecosystem. And to me, that's really concerning. But the root of it is that how separate are these things really? I'm got to be a little harsh here. And it's a lot of Bitcoiners like to say they're separate from the rest of the crypto ecosystem, but it's very hard to make that case when it kind of all moves together.
I mean, you're pointing something out that works in both models at once, right?
True.
And so this is my problem with a lot of the arguments against Bitcoin, especially in this moment where we have so much scare media. Is okay, you have these two models, which is that Bitcoin is backing all of these other plays to take away your liberty on a digital level, or it's completely separate. And nobody's doing actually the discussion work to test one of these models with the other. But like I said, we can talk through it, it existing in both, which automatically leans toward the default being that they're separate. You could have Bitcoin in a world with none of those other things. Could you have those other things in a world without Bitcoin, though? I don't think that you could necessarily. Bitcoin is sort of the proof of concept in terms of digital information being money. Right? If digital information can't be money, then all those other things can't have value. So, the moment Bitcoin exists, you're going to have these experiments, and some of them may move beyond experiments. But that doesn't mean that Bitcoin is bad, right?
I mean, I wasn't trying to be so harsh and say that it's bad, but more in the sense that one of the big problems is that to an outsider, for instance, somebody who hasn't really dabbled that deep into Bitcoin, they don't know that, say, for instance, I think Trump's charting another Trump coin these days. They don't know the real security differences between something like that and actually using, pristine self-custody Bitcoin on your own offline wallet. Like there's a wide range of possibilities. And the problem is, I'm going to be honest, like much of the like influencer media kind of just want someone like, oh, just buy this. It doesn't matter how you do it. You know, it's like they're trying to rush people into things. And that's not conducive towards actually making proper measured decisions. And like, to be honest, like you gotta rag me for using the word scam, but I mean scam in the really broadest sense of like, you can fool people into using optimal ways of spending their resources. And that's kind of the big problem here, I find, is that the cryptocurrency ecosystem as a whole, I think there's a strong argument that it's a net negative to many of the problems people are concerned about, even if I would concede that in some ways Bitcoin probably can deliver on some of the things you hope it does. But that's the challenge, is that you're never really going to get anything that's pristine perfect. Like guns, for example, a lot of people are like, oh, they're worse than, better. The challenge, though, and I think, is how do you make the good things better while limiting and severely constraining the things that are bad? And I find one of my criticisms of the cryptocurrency space as a whole, even within the Bitcoin community, is many of them are more interested in discussing, oh, the price just hit a new high, rather than how is adoption going? How are people understanding it? How is the ecosystem developing? All those are very serious questions that many people, as you mentioned at meetups, probably didn't even want to answer those questions, because all that matters is number go up.
I just wanted to add what you mentioned about the scams. One of my affiliates, Gabriel Custodia at Watchman Privacy, he's got a great course, Escape the Technocracy. If people use the link on my website or the code Geopolitics, they get 15% off. I'm taking the course. I love it. But he did a recently satirical Bitcoin episode precisely on what you mentioned, Gabe. And it was it doesn't happen that often, but I actually laughed out loud because he was making fun of the cargo cult aspect of Bitcoin and all of these scams that tell you to download this or this commercial app and buy a piece of Bitcoin when you're not actually getting a piece of it. You're buying it through some scam sort of company. So I highly recommend people check that out. But yeah. I don't know if
that was hilarious. I actually really enjoyed it too. Yeah, that was quite a hoot. I laughed quite a bit too.
Yeah, it may be the nature of new technology that you're always going to have salesmen, and that salesmen aren't necessarily telling you fundamentally everything that's going on, right? Like a lot of home appliances, once homes had electricity ubiquitously, you had people who carried around, a vacuum cleaner or a large briefcase with some sort of an object, a blender or whatever, right? Trying to sell people on incorporating this into their house. And you know how salesmen are. They may not even know the truth themselves, but one where were they bad to go around and put all these things in people's homes? Well, it could definitely happen better. That's part of just education in general, but that doesn't mean that the blender was bad or the vacuum cleaner was bad. If Bitcoin succeeds, it will succeed in taking down the largest scam in history, the one that is so ubiquitous, the one that has put more oligarchs into power than any other, which is the ability for some group of people to control the making of money and to use that to weaken other people, to weaken nations, to weaken any other networks that would compete with them. So that's the hope. But other than that, it may be that the Bitcoin community has overestimated the amount that can fix the world. And if that's the case, I mean, maybe in some sense that's fine. We should discuss it because, like I said, I think that we should understand the control mechanisms that lead to these simulations within simulations that keep people weak. And we need to re-educate people. Bitcoin isn't going to do that without us doing a lot of other work, right? Don't make it a cargo cult thing. Just make it something that will serve some particular function, and don't assume that it fixes all the world. There is a lot to be gained though by taking down one scam, even if it does nothing else.
And I would say probably most people are aligned on that. Like even the gold, people who are like gold's good, Bitcoin bad, people who are advocating for other assets. I'm sure many people want to address that issue head on. And I think now there's a lot of political capital for it. I mean, I know there's a lot of talk about Ron Paul, and when it comes to Trump's current transition team, I have no idea how that's going, and I wouldn't be too optimistic about it, but I know the interest is absolutely there. And that is, like, you're right, that's something that deserves its own deep, serious, thoughtful conversations, regardless of whether someone's pro, anti, or what asset they love or hate.
And you know, just these conversations right here, we may be saving a lot of people money just by making them think through scams. For example, gold is not without scams. Just because it's physical doesn't mean there aren't scams. Paper gold is a multi-trillion-dollar, multi-generational scam. Right? Gold can be rehypothesized so long as you believe in an IOU written down on a piece of paper. You know, somebody says that you have this gold in an account. That's just as digital, actually, but it's digital without the security of being checked by tens of thousands of computers around the world, right? And that's what Bitcoin provides, is that check. And ultimate, and maybe like one last point on like thinking about gold. People go, well, gold has other uses. You can make teeth out of it. It has minor uses in electronics, right? There are people who try to like throw this. It does mean that there's some inherent value or something like that, but that has nothing to do with what the value of gold is really based on. Think about this: if you could choose two worlds, would you choose the world in which something useful is being used up in the money supply, or the one where it's not? And, you know, people are going to go back and point that out about energy and say Bitcoin uses other energy, but Bitcoin will not be used to any extent that it costs more energy to use than the current banking system. That is the limit of how much Bitcoin will use energy. And it will cause people to go out and seek new forms of energy like stranded gas. I actually think that there may even be, you know, something like the encirclement of China through Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Ukraine. When you think about how much gas is also in those places and the crisscrossing of gas between the East and the West, there may also be something to, you know, and this may be the, like, you know, one downside of Bitcoin. As many things as I want to say are positive, you know, I do want to also have realistic conversations about the negative. If people know that we're going into toward a Bitcoin world, the finance blob investing in it, maybe it is they want to control those countries where gas can be used rather than flared off, and where it can't be easily brought to a grid or can't be easily sold or something like that. I haven't thought through that completely enough, right? Maybe it's just pipeline gas and I'm talking nonsense, but we should at least ask the question and think it through, right?
I've had in the past William Engdahl on the podcast, fantastic books. I think one of the theses, he's focused a lot on oil, geopolitics, oil wars, and he argued that one of the purposes maybe of these global war and terror wars by the U.S. Was not as much for the West to get the oil, but to deny access to adversaries, which also makes a lot of sense. And I was going to mention one more thing, which I guess I'm forgetting. But yeah, any other thoughts? And if you guys want to sort of re-summarize maybe some of the basic points, because you know a lot of this stuff is still confusing for a lot of folks. Oh, I was going to say I like that principle of diversification. What you said, Matthew, earlier. You know, I always believe in having a core portion of precious metals in one's sort of repertoire. But I guess now having a certain amount of Bitcoin and land, I think, is important as well, because if you have physical, tangible assets, land is going to be, I think, extremely useful going forward, because in some ways I see the price mimicking that of gold, Bitcoin, and land. It just keeps going up, and I think that's part of the goal of the BlackRocks of the world, is to deny access to land for the peasantry, for the middle class, because the price just keeps going up and is becoming unattainable. I think that's intentional, and there's a lot you can do. It's going to be extremely useful, I think, if you've got a plot of land with with water and the ability to cultivate. You know, it doesn't have to be huge. That's going to be very important going forward. But yeah, I guess any other thoughts, final thoughts, if you guys want to re-summarize as well, key points.
Yeah, maybe go to first principles. Just ask, what is Bitcoin alone? That's one place to start. And when you think about whether or not it's a good or a bad thing, ask yourself, are you describing Bitcoin when you describe the bad thing? Are these things separable? Because very often it's not, whether or not a certain crayon is in the box moving forward. It's how it is we make use of the whole box, right? So, and that's not to say that I'm certain that Bitcoin is a good thing. I went through this past year really, really reevaluating it, and I still don't know the answer. So don't think of this as like a push advocacy, but I did feel like there were things in the conversation that weren't happening well, and whether or not I've expressed them eloquently, I hope I've given people something to chew on.
Yeah, I hope it's a lot to chew on. And on my end, my big passion driver is I want more people excited about making digital technology work for us rather than against us. And that's a big fight. It's bigger than even, this cryptocurrency discussion. And to me, I find there's a lot of lack of seriousness in that discussion. I really like many of these online, more privacy centric services, but I'm going to be honest, I feel like a lot of it is just kind of a new cargo cult people are trying to adopt. And I think the bedrock has to be truly understanding these things, building a perspective, and actually reaching out to people who aren't technically savvy. I created this series where I wanted to reach out to people who are different than me and say, hey, how is technology impacting you? How can we make it better? I think there is a remarkable amount of opportunity if we start asking those questions. And that, of course, can cross back into the finance realm and the Bitcoin realm. I think it is so important to really think about how we, in our own lives, can create opportunities for those around us rather than necessarily scrounging over, oh, what's the big next scare thing that we're all supposed to freak out about.
Yeah, well, just one recent example, Terry Wolf, which all of you are familiar with. He was, I think you wrote about this, how he's switched to Linux now. I've had that goal, or at least dual boot first, and then you've got your toe in both waters there. But all right, a lot to chew on here with Bitcoin. The timing, we had scheduled this. The timing was on point. Where do people go to? All of your links are in the description as always, but best places for people to go for your stuff, guys.
Go ahead, Gabe.
I'm at LibreSolutions.network, and that's my passion project I alluded to earlier.
My Substack is called Rounding the Earth. I also have a locals where I do have some discussions, and people can come and chatter. Aside from full articles that I'm producing, it's a better place for little bits of small conversation between the big articles.
And your locals, is that for subscribers only? And then you do how does that work? You do
95% of the posts are not locked. There's a little bit that's subscribers only, but some people can choose to support me like they would a Patreon by subscribing there. But it's only a modest amount of subscriber only content.
All right. I'm sure we'll be talking again in the future with both of you or separately on geopolitics and empire. And thanks again for being guests.
Thanks, Travoye.
Thank you.